Alright, welcome to Foundry VTT. This is a pretty basic tutorial on how to set up a map and get started on Foundry. You'll notice I actually already have my map selected. I'll go through that process real quick in a second, but basically what I want to cover is how to make your scene ready for a session, how to put walls on the scene, how to add actors to a scene, how to add tiles if you want to add tiles, and this is based on a configuration of setups that I have using some modules like Molinet, and some other resources we'll talk about in a little bit. But let's get to it, starting with how to set up your map. So I've already added a map. It is the Lunoid Plaza by Venatus Maps. I'll go into the configuration window so you can see it. You'll notice that this map is in a grid size of 140. I've actually set it to be 280 for my demonstration because I want it to be a smaller map in terms of scale. So when I want my players moving around the scene, I don't want there to be quite as much space between things, that if there's a combat, it's faster to move around, stuff like that. But you could definitely run this map at 140 pixels grid instead, or you could even double that to 560 pixel grid if you really wanted this to be a cozy, cramped battlefield. I think that adds some problems perhaps with the buildings being ridiculously small, but that's neither here nor there. You can certainly modify things as you want. You'll notice on this window that I've already set this background image. This is a map that I've downloaded off of Molnet Cloud. You'll see that I have the navigation toggled and the scene name, town demonstration, and that the navigation is set to GM only. So if I were to go to another page, such as the landing page for the server, I could then move back to the scene without having to navigate it in my scene list, which is this tab on the right here. Oops, I did not mean to click that. You'll notice that there's also some other options here. There's navigation name, so if I want this to show up as just town, I could. And you'll notice here it shows up as town, whereas here it still shows in my scene list as town demonstration. That can be useful if you have a bunch of maps that have the same navigation name. Let's say you've used a bunch of villages in your campaign and you're just naming your villages as village because you're not creative and you just want to stress that, but you want to make sure you know which village, so you might name it village session 3. That's an option you have. You can also set a foreground image. If you have an image that is smaller that you want to put on top, it will be above everything else in the scene, including your grid and things like that. So that can be useful. It can also be a big oops if you put your background image in your foreground image and it covers everything up and you're like, why didn't my token show up? Why is nothing working? You probably put it in the foreground image. And I've selected a file already I've uploaded. I could upload a file if I want to, but I'm just going to use this map. It's nice, it's simple, it's open, it lets me show off some options, so that's what we're going to work with. We also have some vision and lighting settings. Token vision, if you turn that off, everyone can see everything. Walls don't matter. To fog exploration, basically sets up a fog vor, so if you have walls, players can't see behind the fog. Unrestricted vision range. If a token has a clear line of sight, which means no walls block it, nothing like that, then a character or token can see everything unless there's a wall. If you want to have a map that's outdoors during the day, you can toggle this on and you don't have to worry about your character's vision. If they have dark vision settings set up, it works. I would recommend, unless you intentionally want to have darkness, you leave that on. You can also adjust the darkness level here, so I could make it look like it's at night. I didn't even make it very dark. And I could also set a vision limitation threshold, which would turn off that unrestricted vision range. So here it would be disabled. Here it would still be universal vision, even though it's a little bit dark. And here, obviously, it's normal. That means that Atmosphere is a module I have that allows me to modify some settings. You don't need to worry about this. That background volume slider is if you're using a video file for your background, and that comes from a module. Otherwise, you can set these to display journal notes, play an audio playlist when the scene is activated, play sounds in particular, play weather effects. I don't have a lot of these set up. I don't usually use these. I also have wall height enabled. That is a module that lets you set certain walls at certain heights so that if you have characters that are flying, it handles vision. But I'm not going to worry about that at this moment, so we will move on from there and just talk about getting this map set up. So I have a pretty open map here. There's some shrubbery, there's some fountains, and there's some buildings, so there's a little bit of everything for everyone. I'm going to go to my wall controls here, and you'll notice that I have some extra things here that might not show up on default. Particularly this display walls and other layers toggle comes from a module, DF Architect, and that basically just means that if I draw a wall, I click to another layer, I see it, and that module adds that toggle for other things. I can toggle it for light, so that if I have a light, you'll notice that that light is occluded by the wall. It will demonstrate the outer range of that light. Very useful for making sure if you're building a map that you are getting things correct. I'm not going to have any maps in this light because there are no torches, and it is an outdoor scene, so I will just be using the uninterrupted line of sight vision restrictions. Now, there are a couple ways I could put walls on this map. Let's say for this big building at the top here, let's say it's some sort of government office. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drag a wall, hold control. By holding control, I can immediately place another wall at the end point of the first wall. And then boom. And this wall that I've placed is an ordinary wall. So if I drag an observer token out, let me go to my actors and drag out the observer, which is an owl. You'll notice that I have here an owl. And that owl, if I select it, which I've done right now, cannot see through this wall. It can see if I move it around that that wall extends to the edges of the map. By default, tokens can actually move off the map. So what we want to do to fix that is just click this wall off edges of the scene. You'll notice there's actually a pixel or two inside, so it doesn't actually snap all the way to the edge. I think this is to do with, obviously I can move it through SDM. If I use arrow keys, it treats it as player movement and won't let me move it through. I think the reason for this is some bounding issues. If you've ever made maps for, wow, going to sound really old here. If you've ever made maps for Doom, you'll know that sometimes they'll add a second or third wall to make sure that people don't get out of ground and moving at a very high speed. It's the same general principle here. These walls are slightly inside because that way the tabletop knows that movement should stop. If you put it right on the grid, sometimes characters can glitch through, especially if you're doing things like diagonal walls going along the grid. Sometimes when a token is halfway on a wall, they can step through. So that's something to be aware of. So for example, if I was doing a wall like this, actually let me snap that to grid so it's a better example. If I was doing a wall like this where it's perfectly diagonal, I would actually probably want to also add some invisible walls along that grid so that if a token were to try to move into that space, they couldn't, and then they couldn't clip through that wall like they could if I were to move them. Actually, I did that wall very badly because it's not perfectly diagonal. But there are certain circumstances where, especially if you're running Foundry on a remote server, you can actually glitch tokens through walls. So it won't work for me because I'm running this the way I am, but that's just important to know. If your players are constantly moving through your walls, you should just add more bounding walls so that that doesn't happen. But I've kind of shown you a little bit of some of the wall types. That first wall I do is just a standard wall. And if we open up that properties window by double clicking on one of the endpoints, it will say movement restrictions normal, sight restrictions normal, sound restriction normal, wall direction both, and is it a door? And if it is a door, then what its state is, and then wall height comes from that wall height module. By default, walls will be of infinite height. But that's not the only type of wall there are. Let's say I want people to be able to see my buildings on my map, even though I want them to also not be able to move through. I'm going to forget to turn off grid snapping because I don't want this to snap to grid. I want it to conform to the building. I want to do a wall here so that this building resembles its outline better. And you'll notice that this wall is green as I'm putting it down because it is not the same kind of wall. It is a terrain wall. Terrain walls are a kind of wall in Foundry that function as physical barriers, but only block sight if there are two or more terrain walls between the target and where they're looking. So terrain walls are often used for things like the shrubbery here, for buildings that players should be able to see the facade of so they know what it is. But then also you want to let them see through it, but not necessarily see what's on the other side. Perhaps this isn't the right wall for this particular kind of shrubbery. You'll notice that it looks kind of open, but I'm going to use it here because I think it works better and differentiates it from the type of wall I want to use for the fountain. So let me finish terrain walling off these planters here in the center, and then we will move on to a different type of wall. And I'm holding the control key again so that I can click, and I'm just clicking as I go along. It is sealing off, and then when I want to end that, I just release control and click on the first endpoint, and it makes more or less a closed loop. And you'll notice if we select our observer token that with some jankiness, because some of those terrain walls overlap, which is something you do need to be mindful of when making terrain walls, the owl can see those buildings, can see those planters, but cannot move through them. So can move around them, but not through them. And if I had wall height on, this owl could fly up and go over those walls, and you'll notice that it can move through this grid here, where there's some room to maneuver. One thing I don't like is that I'm occluding some of the line of sight of that planter, but even that's not really the end of the world. I mean, he is looking through a bush to see that, so it's reasonable, but not necessarily the ideal use case. If we wanted to be really finicky about that, we could switch some of these walls to be directional, so that if you're looking at them from a certain side, they block your line of sight, from another they don't. That's a little bit finicky for now. So what I'm going to do is hop back to this wall there, and I have a fountain here. And because of my fastidiousness about getting wet, I don't want my players jumping in this fountain. I want them to be blocked off from jumping in this fountain. But I also want them to be able to see through it normally. So I'm going to grab my invisible wall tool, and draw some walls. Oops, that's pretty badly centered. Draw some walls around this fountain, so that if any of my players decide they want to hop in the fountain, I can say, as you're about to hop in the fountain, the guard stops you and says, "What are you doing? Fountains aren't for people, they're for birds," and keep you from entering. My Kenku players are going to be very excited about that. Everyone else is going to suffer. I decided Kirk might make it into, but and so now you'll see that there's an invisible wall there. Again, this wall won't be visible to players. It's visible because of that architect module that lets me see walls on other layers. But you'll see that the owl can, I'm pressing the arrow key to move into that fountain, and he won't. And you'll see that he can sort of move around that fountain, but he can't hop in. Meanwhile, I could drag him in. I could also set a wall height on these invisible walls, because again, they're around a fountain. I just set them to be like top 1, bottom 0. And then I can go to my owl, move him here, and he can actually pass over because the wall is short enough. But a creature that wasn't able to pass over would not be able to perhaps give a better demonstration. Instead of doing it as height 1, I could set it to height 10. And you'll notice that now if I try to move the owl with the arrow keys, it will not move. If I set the owl height to 10, we'll be able to move through that freely. And so that's a way that you can set that up to be able to use those to prevent movement, but also tolerate flying. You can also set default settings for that, but that's something for another time. There's also some options to, for example, merge a line of walls into a single wall, and to split selected walls into 2 walls. That, I believe, comes from the architect module as well. But that can be useful if you're doing something where you've put a wall down, but you want to put a door in for players to pass through, and so you can split that wall and then drag the endpoints in order to make that door work. There are a couple other types of walls that I probably need to talk about before we move on from walls. There are ethereal walls. Ethereal walls are walls that block sight and sound, but not movement. So if I select my observer token, you'll see that this wall is keeping him from seeing the other side, but he can just move right through it with the arrow keys. There's nothing physically keeping him from moving, but he can't see through it. That's useful for if you want to do like a fog gate before a boss fight, like from Dark Souls, or if you want to have an illusory wall that players can move through if they find out that there's an illusion, but can't move through if they can't. You can let players discover that dynamically on their own instead of having to reveal it via roleplay. You can have players moving around. You can also tweak these settings individually. Now, sound will only change things if you're using a musical effect or a sound effect, something that would generate on the other side of the wall that plays in scene. You can play sound effects for players in Foundry that play out of scene. That wouldn't be blocked by this. This is a good opportunity, though, to perhaps set a directional wall. So let's say I have a ethereal wall that I want players to be able to see through on one side. You'll notice because I've set it to be the left here, which is facing this way, and I have, thanks to that architect module, when I select a wall, it will tell me which way is which. Actually, I won't do that because I have a wall set there, but you'll notice here that it says right and left. And so if I set it to be right only, it would only block people coming out from the fountain. If I set left only, it would only block people going into the fountain. But you'll notice that because I've set this ethereal wall this way, you can see through it from this side, but when you step through, you can't. So if you wanted to do a one-way mirror or something like that, you could do that. And then if you wanted to make it so that that block movement, you could set it to a different type of wall that does block movement. Let's talk about doors. There are two types of doors, doors and secret doors. And they function basically identically to DMs, but they function differently to players. So let's snap to grid and do a door and a secret door. And for these, they're both going to have the standard wall properties when closed. So you'll notice that if I open this up, it's normal, 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 both, secret, closed. For the other door, it will be all the same, except that secret is set to door. And I could set this to be none. I could set any of these settings to be different. So if I wanted to have, no sight restriction, but a movement restriction, I could do so. You could make a wall out of an invisible wall. You could turn that into a door. And then when I go back to my actor layer, and normally these walls will disappear when you're on the actor layer, but you'll notice that there are these door icons. And these door icons basically let you interact with these walls. There's a third door state besides closed, which is locked. A locked door is one that players can't interact with. So if I click on this, it will play that locked sound effect, and it will not open. You'll notice that to my observer token, since these are set to be ordinary walls, they both block vision. As a DM, you can lock or unlock doors by right mouse clicking. That's especially important if you have players who are particularly bad about opening doors without asking. And you can also lock secret doors, though that's a little bit less important because you can only toggle those as a DM in player view. The secret door icon will not display for players. This door icon would be displayed. And on an ordinary door, you can open it by just clicking on it. And if you want to lock a door in play, if you want to do it quickly so that your players can't just unlock a door when they first approach it, but then they make their thieves tools check to unlock it, you can just right-click that lock and will make it accessible for players. And I think it's been a while since I've double-checked this, but for players, a locked door looks like that ordinary door icon. That doesn't apply to secret doors because they can't see secret doors, but that is the fundamentals of walls. And we could wall off the rest of the scene, but it really doesn't matter. But we will talk next about some lights. But for now, that is all. Until next time.